The crack of a revolver echoed across the dusty main street of Independence, Missouri. But it was not the sound of the gun that silenced the crowd gathered outside the general store. It was the words that followed. Tessa Rawlings stood her ground, smoke still curling from the barrel of her father's old Colt she'd fired into the air, her voice carrying with unexpected power for a woman of 22. "I will not be silenced any longer," she declared, her amber eyes flashing with defiance beneath the brim of her worn bonnet. "This town needs to hear the truth, whether it suits Mayor Crawford's pocketbook or not." It was the spring of 1876, and Independence was experiencing a renewal as a crucial supply point for westbound travelers, despite the railroad's growing dominance over the once mighty wagon trains. The town elders, a collection of businessmen and landowners, had recently approved a plan to reroute the local creek to accommodate a new mill, one that would conveniently benefit the mayor's brother-in-law while destroying the water access for several small farms south of town. "That woman's got the devil in her," muttered Mrs. Holcomb to her husband as they backed away from the commotion. "Just like her mother, God rest her soul." Tessa had inherited more than just her mother's copper-red hair and strong chin. She'd inherited her sense of justice and unwillingness to conform to what was expected of a proper young lady in frontier society. Since her father's death 6 months prior, she'd been fighting to keep their small bookshop alive while caring for her younger brother, Thomas, who had just turned 16. Without parents to temper her outspokenness, Tessa had become increasingly vocal about the corruption she witnessed in Independence. "The creek diversion will ruin at least 12 family farms," she continued, lowering the gun but not her voice. "Those families have worked that land for years, and you're willing to sacrifice their livelihoods for one man's profit." Sheriff Wilson pushed through the gathering crowd, his weathered face set in a frown beneath his gray mustache. "Miss Rawlings, causing a public disturbance with a firearm is against the law. I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." "Is speaking the truth a crime now, Sheriff?" Tessa challenged, though she allowed him to take the revolver from her hand. "No, but firing a weapon in the town center certainly is," he responded firmly. "Your father would be ashamed of such behavior." Those words stung more than she cared to admit. Her father had been respected in Independence despite his more progressive ideas. He taught her to read and think critically at a time when many still questioned whether educating girls beyond basic domestic skills was necessary. But he had also counseled prudence and diplomacy, traits Tessa found increasingly difficult to exercise in the face of such blatant injustice. As the sheriff led her toward the jailhouse, whispers followed in their wake. Women pulled their children closer as if her rebellious spirit might be contagious. Men shook their heads in disapproval. Only Thomas stood loyally by, promising to mind the shop until she returned. "You'll be lucky if Judge Peterson only finds you," Sheriff Wilson said as he unlocked the cell door. "But if you keep this up, people will start wondering if you're fit to raise your brother." Tessa's heart sank at the implied threat. Without her, Thomas would likely be sent to their only living relative and uncle in St. Louis, who had made it clear he had no interest in taking in his brother's children. As the cell door clanged shut, she sank onto the narrow cot, the fire of her conviction dampened but not extinguished. From the small window, she could see the town continuing its business as if nothing had happened. Only one figure remained still, watching the jailhouse with apparent interest, a tall man leaning against a hitching post, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. Tessa had never seen him before, but something about his steady gaze made her straighten her shoulders. She would not give Independence the satisfaction of seeing her broken. Several hours later, Sheriff Wilson returned with unexpected news. "Your fine's been paid," he announced gruffly. "You're free to go, but I don't want to see you causing trouble again, Miss Rawlings." Confused, Tessa gathered her shawl. "Who paid it? Was it Thomas? He shouldn't have. We need that money for the shop." "Not your brother," Wilson replied, unlocking the cell. "It was Darius Caldwell." The name meant nothing to her. "I don't know any Caldwell. He's passing through. Cattle driver turned rancher, from what I gather. Said something about appreciating anyone willing to stand up for what's right." The sheriff's tone made it clear he didn't share this sentiment. Strange fellow to be taking an interest in local matters. Stepping into the late afternoon sunlight, Tessa found herself face to face with the man she'd noticed earlier. Up close, she could see he was perhaps 30, with keen blue eyes and several days' worth of stubble darkening his jaw. His clothes were trail-worn but of good quality, and the gun at his hip looked well used but meticulously maintained. "Mr. Caldwell, I presume?" she asked, lifting her chin to meet his gaze directly. He nodded, removing his hat in a gesture of respect that surprised her. Most men in town had stopped offering her such courtesies months ago. "Miss Rawlings, I hope you don't mind my interference. Seemed a waste to keep someone locked up for speaking uncomfortable truths." His directness caught her off guard. "I'm grateful, though confused by your generosity." "You're not from Independence. Just arrived yesterday, planning to stay a while before heading to my new property near the Kansas border." He gestured toward the main street. "May I walk you back to your establishment? Your brother seemed concerned." Tessa hesitated only briefly before nodding. As they walked, she was acutely aware of the stares and whispers from townspeople. Being seen with a stranger would only add fuel to the gossip, but she found herself caring less than she might have expected. "You mentioned a creek diversion," Darius said as they navigated the busy sidewalk. "I'd be interested to hear more about it, if you're willing to share." His request, delivered without condescension, was so unexpected that Tessa nearly stopped walking. For months, she tried to raise concerns about the mayor's various schemes, only to be dismissed as a hysterical woman or a troublemaker. No one had actually asked to hear her thoughts. "Why would you care about our local politics?" she questioned, studying him with newfound interest. Darius's expression remained earnest. "Water rights have started more feuds than gold ever did. I've seen what happens when powerful men redirect resources for their own gain. It rarely ends well for the common folk." By the time they reached Rawlings Books and Stationery, Tessa had provided a detailed explanation of the situation with the creek and Mayor Crawford's pattern of self-serving decisions. To her surprise, Darius asked intelligent questions that suggested he understood both the practical implications for farmers and the legal complexities of water rights. Thomas was sweeping the porch when they arrived, his relief at seeing his sister evident in his face, which bore the same coppery freckles as Tessa's, though his hair was a darker auburn. "You didn't need to worry, Thomas," Tessa assured him. "It was just a fine." "Which you couldn't afford," her brother retorted before turning curiously to Darius. "Thank you for helping my sister, sir." Darius extended his hand. "Darius Caldwell, and it was no hardship. Your sister's courage is commendable." Thomas shook the offered hand with a grin. "Most people in town use different words to describe it. Most people fear those who speak uncomfortable truths," Darius replied. "It makes them confront their own complacency." The bell above the shop door jingled as Mrs. Pemberton, wife of the bank president, exited with her daughter Caroline. Upon seeing Tessa, her expression soured. "I was just explaining to Caroline why we'll be ordering our books from St. Louis from now on," she announced loudly. "I cannot support a business run by someone who shows such disregard for proper behavior." Young ladies should focus on appropriate pursuits, not rabble-rousing. Before Tessa could respond, Darius spoke, his voice pleasant but firm. I found that reading widely tends to broaden one's perspective on what constitutes appropriate behavior, madam. Perhaps more books rather than fewer would be beneficial. Mrs. Pemberton's mouth dropped open in shock before she gathered her dignity and hurried away, pulling a wide-eyed Caroline along. Thomas failed to suppress a snort of laughter, earning a reproachful look from his sister despite her own urge to smile. "You shouldn't antagonize potential customers on my behalf, Mr. Caldwell," Tessa said, though there was gratitude in her voice. "Our business can't afford to lose more patrons." "Then allow me to become a patron myself," he replied. "I've been too long on the trail without decent reading material, and please call me Darius." Over the next 2 weeks, Darius became a regular visitor to the bookshop. He purchased several volumes, histories, agricultural texts, and even poetry, and often stayed to discuss them with Tessa when the store wasn't busy, which was increasingly often as more townspeople chose to take their business elsewhere. Tessa learned that Darius had driven cattle up from Texas in his younger days, before saving enough to purchase land of his own. He was educated, having attended school in Chicago, until his father's death forced him west to make his own way at 18. Now, at 31, he was establishing a ranch that he hoped would eventually supply breeding stock to local farmers. What impressed her most, however, was his willingness to listen. When she explained how the town council had systematically ignored the needs of the poorer sections of independents while catering to business interests, he asked questions rather than dismissing her concerns. When she shared her ideas for how things could be improved, he offered thoughtful feedback instead of condescending explanations of why her feminine thinking was impractical. "You're unlike any woman I've encountered," he told her one quiet afternoon as she shelved new inventory. Most would have yielded to the pressure by now. Tessa paused, a volume of Emerson's essays in her hand. "My father always said that principles aren't principles if you only stand by them when it's convenient. A wise man. He was." She placed the book carefully on the shelf. "He also believed that education was the right of everyone, regardless of gender or circumstance. That's why he opened this shop, to bring books to people who might otherwise never encounter them." Darius watched her with undisguised admiration. "And now you're carrying on his legacy, despite the town's disapproval. For all the good it's doing," she sighed, gesturing to the empty shop. "We've lost nearly half our regular customers. If things continue this way, we'll have to close by autumn. What will you do then?" The question had haunted her for weeks. "I'm not sure. Thomas deserves to finish his education, but teaching positions for women who speak their minds too freely are scarce. And writing, you have a gift with words." Tessa smiled wryly. "Female authors still rely on male pseudonyms or remain anonymous. Not exactly a path to financial security." Before Darius could respond, the shop door opened, and Mayor Crawford himself entered, accompanied by Mr. Pemberton from the bank. Neither acknowledged Darius as they approached the counter where Tessa stood. "Miss Rawlings," the mayor began, his tone falsely congenial, "I've come to discuss a matter of some importance to your future." Tessa straightened. "If this concerns the petition against the creek diversion, I stand by every signature I collected." "This isn't about your misguided campaign," Crawford replied dismissively. "It's about the outstanding loan on this building." Cold dread settled in Tessa's stomach. "That loan isn't due for repayment for another year. My father arranged the terms with Mr. Pemberton personally. And under normal circumstances, those terms would stand," Pemberton interjected smoothly. "However, given the recent..." Instability in your situation. The bank has deemed it prudent to exercise the acceleration clause. Acceleration clause, she repeated, unfamiliar with the term. It allows the bank to demand immediate repayment if there's reason to believe the borrower's circumstances have changed significantly enough to put the loan at risk, Darius supplied, stepping forward. It's rarely invoked except in cases of death or bankruptcy. The mayor looked annoyed at the interruption. Mr. Caldwell, this is a private business matter. One that seems conveniently timed given Miss Rawlings' opposition to your plans, Darius observed calmly. The timing is irrelevant, Pemberton insisted. The fact is, the shop's income has declined dramatically. We have a responsibility to our depositors. How much is owed? Darius asked, directing his question to Tessa. She hesitated, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. $320. You have until the end of the month to repay the full amount, Crawford stated with obvious satisfaction. Otherwise, the property will be auctioned to cover the debt. After they left, Tessa braced herself against the counter, fighting back tears of frustration. They've been waiting for an opportunity like this. The shop property is valuable, right in the center of town. Do you have any savings? Darius asked gently. Some, but nowhere near enough. Father's medical bills took most of what we had. She looked up at him with sudden suspicion. Why are you still in Independence, Darius? You mentioned passing through to your ranch weeks ago. He didn't immediately answer, his gaze moving to the window where the town's main street was visible. I found reasons to delay my departure. What reasons? His eyes returned to hers, their blue intensity causing her breath to catch. Perhaps I recognized something rare when I saw a woman brave enough to stand alone against an entire town. The following Sunday, Tessa attended church as always, though she'd come to dread the weekly service. What had once been a source of community now felt like an exercise in endurance as she weathered cold stares and whispered comments. Thomas sat protectively beside her, having refused her suggestion that he distance himself from her growing notoriety. You're my sister, he'd said firmly. We face things together. She was surprised when Darius slipped into the pew beside them just as Reverend Walsh began his sermon. Though impeccably dressed in what was clearly his best suit, Darius still stood out among the merchants and farmers of Independence with his rancher's bearing and sun-weathered complexion. The Reverend's sermon that morning seemed almost deliberately pointed, focusing on the virtues of feminine submission and the dangers of pride. Several times, Tessa felt eyes turning in her direction as particular passages were emphasized. It is not for women to presume authority over men, Reverend Walsh intoned, but to learn in quietness and full submission. Beside her, Darius shifted uncomfortably. When she glanced at him, she found his expression troubled, his jaw tight with what appeared to be controlled anger. He caught her looking and offered a reassuring smile that warmed something inside her chest. After the service, as congregants gathered outside to socialize, several men approached Darius, apparently curious about the stranger who had been spending time with the town's most controversial resident. Mr. Caldwell, Judge Peterson called, I understand you've purchased the old Hargrove place out near the border. That's correct, Darius confirmed politely. Fine piece of land, commented Henry Dixon, who owned the largest mercantile in town. Though a man needs a wife to make a proper home, especially out in that isolation. Several of the men chuckled, and Tessa noticed meaningful glances exchanged between Mrs. Dixon and several other matrons who had daughters of marriageable age. When the right woman comes along, Darius replied neutrally, I'll know it. Mrs. Dixon smiled broadly. We're having a dinner this Friday evening. Several families will be attending, those with eligible young ladies included. You'd be most welcome. Thank you for the invitation, Darius said, but I've already made arrangements for Friday evening. He turned to Tessa, his expression warm. Miss Rawlings has agreed to advise me on expanding my personal library. The shock that rippled through the gathered townspeople was almost palpable. Mrs. Dixon's smile froze, while Judge Peterson's bushy eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. Mr. Caldwell, the judge began carefully, as a newcomer to our community, you may not be aware of Miss Rawlings' reputation. I'm quite aware of how Miss Rawlings is perceived, Darius replied, his tone hardening slightly. I find it curious that a town would so quickly condemn someone for advocating on behalf of its most vulnerable citizens. An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Tessa, torn between gratitude for his defense and concern that he was endangering his own standing in the community, finally spoke up. We should be going. Thomas has studies to complete before tomorrow. She nodded politely to the gathered townspeople, most of whom had been friends of her parents. Good day. As they walked away, Thomas whispered, That was better than any dime novel showdown. Darius chuckled. I didn't mean to create a scene. You didn't, Tessa assured him. They did by trying to warn you away from the town pariah. Their loss is my gain, he said simply, and the way he looked at her then made her cheeks flush with warmth despite the cool spring breeze. That afternoon, as Tessa was closing the shop, a group of young men she recognized as the sons of several prominent families blocked her path. Their leader, William Crawford, the mayor's son, stepped forward with a sneer. Your cowboy friend isn't around to protect you now, he taunted. You should know that no decent man will ever want damaged goods like you. The only thing damaged is your manners, William, Tessa retorted, trying to step around him. He moved to block her again. My father says once the bank takes your shop, you'll have no choice but to leave Independence. No one will hire you, no one will associate with you. You're finished here. That's enough, Crawford, came a familiar voice. Darius approached from across the street, his hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. A gentleman doesn't harass a lady on a public street, or anywhere else for that matter. William's courage visibly faltered in the face of Darius's calm intensity. This isn't over, he muttered before retreating with his companions. Are you all right? Darius asked once they were alone. Tessa nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. They're just words. Words can cut deeper than knives sometimes. He offered his arm. May I walk you home? As they strolled through the fading daylight, Tessa found herself wondering what it would be like to leave Independence to start fresh somewhere where her outspokenness might be valued rather than condemned. But such dreams required resources she didn't have. I've been thinking about your situation, Darius said as they approached the modest house behind the bookshop where she and Thomas lived. Would you consider a business proposition? Tessa looked at him curiously. What kind of proposition? I have the funds you need to repay the bank loan, he stated directly. I'd like to invest in your bookshop as a silent partner. She stopped walking, stunned by the offer. Why would you do that? Several reasons. First, I believe in what your father was trying to accomplish. Education changes lives, I've seen it firsthand. Second, it's a sound business decision. Once the controversy dies down, the shop will recover. And third, she prompted, sensing he was holding something back. Darius hesitated. Third, I admire you, Tessa. Your courage, your principles, your intelligence. I'd like to help if you'll allow it. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, but pride made her hesitate. I can't accept charity, Darius. It isn't charity. It's an investment with terms we can negotiate fairly. His eyes held hers steadily. Will you at least consider it? After a moment, she nodded. I'll consider it, but I need time to think. That night, Tessa barely slept, turning over Darius's offer in her mind. By morning, she had come to a decision. She would accept his help, but only as a proper business arrangement with clear terms and her remaining the majority owner. She would not be beholden to any man, no matter how kind or supportive. When she arrived at the shop to open for the day, however, she found the front window shattered, books strewn across the floor, many with pages torn out or covers ripped off. On the wall behind the counter, someone had painted a crude message: "Leave or worse will come." Sheriff Wilson made a cursory investigation but offered little hope of finding the culprits. "No witnesses," he said with a shrug that suggested he wasn't particularly motivated to look too hard. "Probably just boys getting into mischief." Boys who coincidentally targeted the one shop whose owner opposes the mayor's plans. Tessa challenged bitterly. "I suggest you focus on cleaning up rather than making more accusations, Miss Rawlings," the sheriff replied before leaving. Thomas helped her salvage what books they could and board up the window, his young face grim with anger and determination. "We can't let them win, Tess." "We won't," she promised, though she wasn't sure how they would fight back against such tactics. When Darius arrived later that day and saw the destruction, his expression darkened with a cold fury she hadn't witnessed in him before. "This goes beyond harassment. This is criminal intimidation." "And yet no one will be held accountable," Tessa said wearily, sweeping up broken glass. "The sheriff made that clear enough. There are other forms of accountability." Darius surveyed the damage thoughtfully. "Have you considered my offer?" "I have," she replied, setting aside her broom. "I'll accept your investment, but only under proper business terms. And I retain control of what books we carry and how the shop is run." "I wouldn't have it any other way," he assured her. "Your vision is what makes this place special." As they discussed the details, Darius revealed that he had been making inquiries about the creek diversion plan and had uncovered some interesting information. The mayor doesn't just stand to benefit through his brother-in-law. He's quietly purchased land that will increase in value once the mill is operational. Tessa's eyes widened. "That's a clear conflict of interest. If people knew, they should know," Darius agreed. "But it needs to be presented in a way they can't ignore or dismiss as a woman's hysteria." Over the next week, they formulated a plan. While Tessa reopened the shop and continued her daily operations despite dwindling customers, Darius gathered evidence of the mayor's secret land purchases through contacts at county offices in neighboring towns. Together with Thomas, they prepared a detailed report documenting how the creek diversion would damage not just the southern farms but eventually affect water quality throughout the area. Rather than making another public spectacle, Tessa took a different approach. She penned a series of letters with Darius's help, sending them to newspapers in nearby cities, the territorial governor, and several prominent businessmen who had interests in independence but weren't part of the mayor's inner circle. Their efforts might have gone unnoticed except for an unexpected ally. Caroline Pemberton, the banker's daughter who had been forbidden from patronizing the bookshop, secretly visited Tessa one afternoon. "I heard about what happened to your store," she said hesitantly. "It isn't right, what they're doing to you." "Thank you for saying so," Tessa replied, surprised by the visit. "But your father wouldn't approve of you being here." Caroline lifted her chin in a gesture reminiscent of Tessa herself. "I've been thinking about what Mr. Caldwell said that day about reading widely broadening one's perspective. He was right, and I've overheard things at dinner that you should know." What Caroline revealed was startling. The creek diversion plan included provisions to eventually charge all farmers for water access, something that had been deliberately concealed from the town council. Mayor Crawford and his associates planned to create a water company that would control all access to the diverted creek, effectively creating a monopoly on the region's most essential resource. Armed with this new information, Darius suggested they needed to present their case to someone with the power to intervene. The circuit judge arrives next week for the quarterly court session. He outranks Judge Peterson and has authority to review town council decisions. Crawford will try to prevent us from speaking to him, Tessa pointed out. Not if we arrange a private meeting first, Darius countered. I have an acquaintance who knows him from his days practicing law in St. Louis. The day the circuit judge arrived, Independence was abuzz with activity. Court days always brought an influx of people from surrounding areas, creating a carnival-like atmosphere as vendors set up stalls and townspeople gathered to socialize. Tessa and Darius had arranged to meet the judge at his hotel before the formal proceedings began. They arrived separately to avoid drawing attention, with Thomas keeping watch outside for any sign of the mayor or his allies. Judge Harmon Monroe was a formidable figure with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing and a reputation for scrupulous fairness. He listened without interruption as Tessa presented their evidence of the mayor's secret land purchases and the hidden plans to charge for water access. "These are serious allegations, Miss Rawlings," he said when she finished. "What is your interest in this matter? Do you own affected property?" "No, Your Honor," she admitted. "But my father taught me that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The families who will lose their water access can't speak for themselves, they risk too much. And you, Mr. Caldwell, what's your stake in this local dispute?" Darius met the judge's gaze steadily. "I believe in standing up for what's right, especially when it's difficult. Miss Rawlings had the courage to do so when no one would listen. I'm simply adding my voice to hers." Something in the way he said it made Tessa glance at him, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the stuffy hotel room. Judge Monroe considered them both for a long moment before nodding. "I'll review these documents thoroughly before today's session. If what you've presented proves accurate, I'll have questions for Mayor Crawford during the public meeting." As they left the hotel, hope flickered in Tessa's heart for the first time in months. Outside, Thomas rushed to meet them, his expression urgent. "The mayor and Sheriff Wilson are looking for you, Tess. They're telling people you've stolen documents from the town office." "That's absurd," she gasped. "I've never—" "It's a preemptive strike," Darius interrupted grimly. "They must have learned about our meeting with the judge." "What do we do now?" Thomas asked, looking between them. Darius took Tessa's hand, his touch steady and reassuring. "We attend the public session and trust that truth will prevail." The town hall was crowded when they arrived, with Mayor Crawford and his supporters prominently seated near the front. Sheriff Wilson approached them immediately. "Miss Rawlings, I need to speak with you about some missing documents," he announced loudly enough for nearby conversations to halt. "Any discussion can wait until after the court session," Darius intervened smoothly. "Judge Monroe is about to begin." The sheriff hesitated, clearly torn between his orders from the mayor and the protocol of the circuit court. Before he could decide, Judge Monroe entered and called the session to order, demanding silence. The routine cases were dealt with efficiently: property disputes, minor offenses, and civil complaints that had accumulated since the judge's last visit. Throughout, Mayor Crawford appeared increasingly anxious, frequently conferring with his allies. Finally, as the formal docket was completed, Judge Monroe cleared his throat. "Before we conclude today's session, I wish to address a matter brought to my attention concerning the proposed creek diversion project." A murmur ran through the crowd as the mayor visibly stiffened. It appears that certain aspects of this project have not been fully disclosed to the town council or the citizens of Independence, the judge continued. Specifically, the formation of a private water company that would charge for access to a resource that is currently free to all property owners along the natural watercourse. Mayor Crawford stood abruptly. Your Honor, with all due respect, town governance is not within the jurisdiction of the circuit court. Corruption and fraud are very much within my jurisdiction, Mayor Crawford, the judge replied sternly. As is the proper disclosure of financial interests by elected officials when voting on matters that may benefit them personally. For the next hour, Judge Monroe methodically outlined the evidence Tessa and Darius had provided, supplemented by his own review of public records. As the details emerged, the mood in the town hall shifted palpably. Citizens who had been hostile to Tessa began exchanging troubled glances as they realized how they would be affected by the hidden aspects of the plan. In light of these findings, Judge Monroe concluded, I am issuing an injunction against the creek diversion project pending a full investigation by the territorial authority. Additionally, I am ordering Mayor Crawford to recuse himself from any further votes on this matter due to undisclosed conflicts of interest. The uproar that followed was deafening. In the midst of the chaos, Darius guided Tessa and Thomas toward the exit, aware that the mayor's humiliation made him more dangerous than ever. This isn't over, he warned them as they hurried back to the bookshop. Crawford won't surrender his plans easily. His prediction proved accurate. That evening, a group of men gathered outside the bookshop, their intentions clearly hostile. Leading them was William Crawford, his face flushed with drink and anger. Come out and face us, Rawlings, he shouted. You've gone too far this time. Inside, Darius positioned himself at the front window, his revolver visible but not yet drawn. Stay back, he instructed Tessa and Thomas. I don't want either of you in the line of fire if this turns ugly. We can't just hide, Tessa argued. That's what they expect for us to cower in fear. Before Darius could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Sheriff Wilson arrived with several deputies, positioning themselves between the mob and the shop. That's enough, William, the sheriff called out. Go home before you do something that lands you in front of Judge Monroe tomorrow. Since when do you care about protecting her? William demanded. You've been helping my father keep her quiet for months. The sheriff's expression hardened. I enforce the law, and right now you're disturbing the peace. Clear out, all of you, or spend the night in jail. To Tessa's surprise, the sheriff then dismounted and approached the shop door. When Darius cautiously admitted him, Wilson removed his hat, looking uncomfortable. Miss Rawlings, I owe you an apology, he said stiffly. I've been willfully blind to certain matters because it was easier than confronting them. That ends today. What changed your mind, Sheriff? Darius asked skeptically. Judge Monroe had some choice words for me in private about my duties to all citizens, not just those with influence. Wilson turned back to Tessa. Your father was a good man who always treated everyone fairly. He'd be proud of what you did today, standing up for those who couldn't stand for themselves. After the sheriff left, promising to keep an eye on the shop throughout the night, Tessa found herself overwhelmed by the day's events. The vindication was sweet, but the emotional toll of months of ostracism and fear suddenly caught up with her. To her embarrassment, tears began streaming down her face. Hey, Darius said softly, drawing her into a gentle embrace. It's over now, you've won. Have I? She whispered against his shoulder. The mayor still has power and allies. The town still sees me as a troublemaker. Nothing's really changed. Everything has changed, he countered, pulling back to meet her eyes. You showed independence that one person with courage can make a difference. The truth is out now, and people will have to reckon with it. Thomas cleared his throat from across the room. I'll go check that the back door is secured, he offered tactfully before disappearing into the storeroom. Alone with Darius, Tessa became acutely aware of how close they were standing, of the warmth of his hand still resting lightly on her arms. "Why did you really stay in Independence?" she asked, the question that had been lingering in her mind for weeks. "Your ranch has been waiting all this time." Darius's gaze never wavered from hers. "I think you know why, Tessa." "I'd like to hear you say it," she pressed, her heart racing. "Because from the moment I saw you standing in that street, refusing to be silenced despite an entire town turning against you, I knew you were extraordinary," he said, his voice low and earnest. "Because every day I spent with you confirmed what I suspected, that you're the kind of woman I've been looking for all my life without realizing it." "And what kind is that?" she asked, hardly daring to breathe. "Brave, principled, compassionate despite everything you've endured." His fingers brushed a strand of hair from her face with exquisite tenderness. "The kind worth changing all my plans for." Tessa had never considered herself a romantic. Practical concerns had always taken precedence, especially after her father's death left her responsible for Thomas and the shop. But standing there with Darius, she felt something bloom inside her chest that no amount of practicality could diminish. "I've never met anyone like you either," she admitted softly. "Someone who actually listens when I speak, who values my thoughts instead of dismissing them." "I'd be a fool not to listen to the smartest person in Independence," he replied with a smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. "Tessa Rawlings, I didn't come to Missouri looking for love, but I found it anyway." When he kissed her, it was gentle yet filled with promise, the promise of a partnership based on mutual respect and admiration. For the first time in months, Tessa felt her burden lighten, shared now with someone strong enough to help carry it without trying to take it from her. The weeks that followed brought significant changes to Independence. Judge Monroe's investigation resulted in Mayor Crawford's censure and the permanent shelving of the Creek Diversion Project. Several council members, implicated in the scheme, resigned rather than face further scrutiny. Business at the bookshop gradually improved as townspeople who had avoided it out of fear of association began to return. Some even offered awkward apologies for their previous coldness, which Tessa accepted with more grace than they perhaps deserved. Darius divided his time between helping at the shop and establishing his ranch, often bringing Thomas along to teach him about land management and animal husbandry, skills the boy eagerly absorbed. The three of them fell into a comfortable rhythm, sharing meals and conversations that ranged from literature to politics to dreams for the future. By midsummer, their courtship was the talk of Independence, though now with more approval than condemnation. The story of how they had exposed corruption and protected the town's water rights had transformed Tessa from pariah to local hero, in many eyes, though she took the change in public opinion with a healthy dose of skepticism. "People have short memories," she remarked to Darius one evening as they sat on the porch of the bookshop after closing. "A year from now, they may well have forgotten who saved their water access." "Does that bother you?" he asked, his arm comfortably around her shoulders. She considered the question seriously. "Not as much as I thought it would. What matters is that we did the right thing, not whether we're celebrated for it." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "That's one of the countless reasons I love you." The words, though often spoken between them now, still sent a thrill through her. "Even though loving me meant delaying your ranch plans for months, the ranch can wait," he said simply. "Some things are more important." As August approached, Darius became unusually secretive, often disappearing for hours without explanation. When Tessa questioned him, he merely smiled and asked for her patience. Finally, on a warm Sunday afternoon, he invited her for a ride to see something special. They traveled several miles outside town to a hill overlooking a vast stretch of prairie. There, to Tessa's astonishment, stood a small cabin with a newly built porch, surrounded by young saplings carefully staked against the prairie winds. "What is this?" she asked, sliding down from her horse. Darius took her hand, leading her toward the cabin. "This is the first building on what will become our ranch if you want it to be." "Our ranch," she repeated, her eyes widening as his meaning became clear. He knelt before her, still holding her hand. "Tessa Rawlings, you've changed my life in ways I never imagined possible. You've shown me what real courage looks like, what it means to stand firm in your convictions even when standing alone. I don't want to spend another day without you by my side." From his pocket, he produced a simple gold ring. "Will you marry me and build a life together, one where both our voices are equally valued?" Tears filled Tessa's eyes, not of sadness or fear, but of overwhelming joy. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, she added with characteristic directness, "But I'm keeping the bookshop. Independence needs it, especially now." Darius laughed, rising to embrace her. "I wouldn't have it any other way. We'll divide our time between the ranch and town. Thomas can help with both as he decides what path he wants to take." "You've thought of everything," she said, touched by his consideration. "I've had months to plan," he admitted. "Since that first day when you fired a shot into the air and demanded to be heard." They were married in September, with Thomas giving his sister away and Judge Monroe performing the ceremony. The church was filled with townspeople, many of whom had come to respect Tessa's outspokenness now that it had been proven justified. Caroline Pemberton served as bridesmaid, having become a close friend and ally in continuing the fight for greater transparency in town governance. She had inherited her father's head for business, but combined it with a social conscience. He lacked a development that both puzzled and secretly pleased him. After the wedding, Tessa and Darius balanced their time between the growing ranch and the thriving bookshop, which expanded to include a small newspaper that published local news alongside articles addressing social issues normally ignored by larger publications. Thomas, now 18, managed the shop when they were at the ranch, showing a natural aptitude for business that suggested he might one day take over entirely. The following spring, as wildflowers bloomed across the prairie surrounding their ranch home, Tessa shared news that brought tears of joy to Darius's eyes. They were expecting their first child. "A son or daughter to carry on your spirit of speaking truth to power," he said, placing a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "And your compassion for listening when others only hear what they want to hear," she added, covering his hand with hers. By the time their daughter Elizabeth was born in November of 1877, Independence had undergone its own transformation. The new mayor, a former schoolteacher who had quietly supported Tessa throughout her ordeal, implemented reforms that made town governance more transparent and inclusive. The creek continued to flow along its natural course, sustaining farms that might otherwise have been abandoned. As Elizabeth grew, she was joined by a brother, James, born 2 years later. The children divided their time as their parents did, between the cultural richness of town and the freedom of ranch life. Both learned early the value of speaking their minds and, equally important, the value of truly listening to others. On Elizabeth's 5th birthday, as the family gathered on the porch of their ranch home watching the sun set over land that now supported a thriving herd of cattle, Tessa reflected on how far they had come. "When I think about how close I came to being forced out of independence," she said to Darius as they watched Thomas teaching the children how to whistle through blades of grass, "it seems almost like a different lifetime." "Would you have left," he asked curiously, "if things had gone differently?" She considered this, leaning against his shoulder. "Eventually, perhaps, but not willingly and not without fighting to the last breath." "That's my Tessa," he chuckled, pressing a kiss to her copper hair, now streaked with the first threads of silver. "Never backing down when it matters." "I've learned when to choose my battles, though," she admitted. "Some fights aren't worth the cost. And some people are worth any cost," he replied, his arm tightening around her waist. "I'd face down an entire town for you all over again." "Let's hope you never have to," she said with a smile. "Though I suspect Elizabeth may give independence plenty to talk about once she's older. She's already asking questions the school teacher can't answer." Darius laughed. "Like mother, like daughter. The world needs more women willing to speak uncomfortable truths." "And more men willing to listen when they do," Tessa added, turning to face him fully. 10 years after that fateful day when Tessa had fired a shot into the air to make independence listen, the town honored her with a most unexpected tribute. The town council voted unanimously to name the new public library after her father, recognizing his vision of education for all as a cornerstone of the community's future. At the dedication ceremony, standing beside her husband with their children and brother watching proudly, Tessa reflected on the power of a single voice and the even greater power of that voice when it finally finds someone willing to truly listen.